welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And we want to welcome back a very special guest. Of course, we have Constantine Sandis on tonight, and he's the director of Lex Academic, visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. His books include The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, Philosophy of Action, an Anthology and Human Nature, and From Action to Ethics, a pluralistic approach to reasons and responsibility. And his newest book, available March 11th, is called Wittgenstein on Other Minds, Strangers in a Strange Land. Constantine, it's a pleasure to have you back on, and thank you for being here.
It's great to see you both again, and thank you so much for having me back on. I'm pleased you're not entirely tired of me, so it's good to see you both.
And I have
It
to
was,
and I have to mention this before we start. So you literally tied Mark White for your fifth appearance, and you guys are tied at number one for most appearances.
yeah.
Now I'm getting competitive.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a little talk with Mark White.
Okay, so as we tend to start, so in his book, Constantine wrote,
Mhm.
I aim to show that although Wittgenstein is indeed marking some valuable distinctions between knowledge and understanding that analytic philosophers have neglected at their peril, we should favor interpretations of his official view according to which our understanding of others is as commonplace as our knowledge of their thoughts and feelings.
Mhm.
While this is in some prima facie tension with his unofficial view, it is ultimately not only compatible with it, but also a significant supplement to it. Or I shall be arguing be suggesting that his official remarks on the role played by forms of life in our understanding of certain groups of people are mirrored by our concern with the relation of entire lives to our understandings of specific individuals. Okay, very complicated stuff. So as Wittgenstein obviously tends to be. So let's start off with something simple. So you argue in the book that our understanding of empathy, which I mean obviously does tend to be pretty simplistic in some ways, especially when you look at pop psychology, it differs from his. So let's start as to how and why.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, when you were reading that sentence out, I was like, oh gosh, maybe I should have broken that up into smaller sentences. So I can speak about the stuff you know what that meant, the thing you read out. But
Oh, please.
before, I mean,
Yeah.
but
Go
in
ahead.
terms of empathy, I mean, he doesn't really use the word. So I mean, that's one way in which his understand. So in a way, he's not. It's not like he's got a philosophy of empathy and he writes about what empathy is and it's different from our notion of empathy or whatever.
Mhm.
It's more that he's we'll talk about the official and the unofficial view and whatever, but across both, he seems really interested in understanding others, whether others be specific individuals or groups of people or cultures or whatever. So he's got these kind of interests. And I guess what's important in a way is that the word empathy doesn't appear,
Mhm.
or indeed sympathy, which was big in, say, Hume, who talked a lot about sympathy. And today, there's a lot of people who they don't quite equate empathy with understanding, but they basically say all there is to understanding others is is empathy. The more empathy you have, the more you understand others. The less you have, the less you do. I'm only slightly exaggerating. I think some psychologists like Simon Baron Cohen pretty much
Mhm.
say this. They also say if you lack empathy, you're a psycho. And if
Right.
you have empathy, um, to a full degree, you will understand everything without. So there are some really quite extreme views out there. So in a way, it's not so much that Wittgenstein has a notion of empathy that's different from ours, is that he seems to do everything one wants. That depends on whether you agree with him, but he seems to do the things people are doing when they're trying to figure out what it takes to understand person or a thing or a creature or whatever. And empathy doesn't seem to be playing a role there. And I don't think it's because he's talking about empathy under a different, he's just using a different word or something like that. And certainly it's not a new concept. It's there before Wittgenstein, and certainly sympathy is there before Wittgenstein.
Mhm.
So there's something interesting about why that is, and part of why I wanted to go to Wittgenstein is I think that it's at the very least a mistake to think empathy is all you need for understanding. Whether if you have if you have zero empathy, that's another question. But the thought that empathy is some kind of magic key that opens up other people's minds or something like that is, I think, a mistake. And the way to understand that is not so much to argue against what these people are saying, but to see how someone does it without the empathy. I actually think, this is me, not Wittgenstein, I actually think empathy is often the effect of understanding rather than the cause. And the great philosopher and psychologist Nietzsche always talked about how we often mistake cause for effect. So empathy is often present when there's understanding there, but not because it's the cause. Rather, it's the result. Once you've understood what someone's going through, then you might feel empathetic. But that's me, not Wittgenstein.
Interesting. So then I guess I have this follow-up question. So in the book, you distinguish you make a distinction between knowledge and understand knowledge of others and understanding others. Why is this distinction so important in Wittgenstein's philosophy?
Yeah, thanks for this. I was hoping you'd ask this question, actually. So philosophy, in both in general and certainly in Wittgenstein's time, um, had a huge focus on knowledge, kind of what we call epistemology. So that was theory of knowledge. Always has been a big thing since Plato's time. Certainly in Wittgenstein's time,
Hmm.
Russell, his teacher, was obsessed with knowledge. Ayer, all these people around then at the time. Um, and the other thing philosophy is big on, and here I guess science in a ways, in other ways, interested in knowledge, of course, as well, in fact, scientific fact. But both philosophy and science are also interested in explanation. So they want
Hmm.
to explain things. So you have theories of whether it's explanation of human action or explanation of chemical processes, or in medical explanation, and so on. So you've got this kind of big thing called theory of explanation, and this big thing called theory of knowledge. And one is big in philosophy of science, and the other is big in kind of epistemology. And understanding, to me, doesn't fit, and to Wittgenstein, doesn't can't be reduced to either of these two things. It's obviously related to them, because if you've explained someone's actions, you hope to have understood why they behave this way.
Hmm.
And if you've understood that, then maybe you know what kind of person they're. So these things are obviously related, but there's a question about whether understanding can be reduced to either knowledge of explanation. So we've sort of got three
Hmm.
things, and there's a question of how they relate to one another. And this is something Wittgenstein is interested in, though he wouldn't have put it the way I just put it now, which to him would have been maybe a bit simplistic and crass.
Hmm.
Um, but the way I think of it is, think of understanding like getting it, whether it's a person or a genre of film or video games, or music is my go-to example, or art, or like painting.
Hmm.
Getting it um, is not something that necessarily reduces to factual knowledge, or indeed explanation. So um, someone who doesn't get death metal, for example, it's
Yeah.
not clear that any amount of prose that they can read is going to be like, right, now I get it.
Right.
Right? That kind of thing, in what it takes for that to click or not click, I don't claim to have the answer, but it doesn't seem to be a question of here's all the facts about death metal or jazz or Italian opera. It doesn't seem to work that way. It seems, and it's not that it's just all you need is experience, because you can be there and hate it and not get
Yeah.
it
Right,
and just,
right,
I just
right.
want to be. It's not like it's just exposure, right? You may just be like, you can expose me all you like, I'm never going to get it.
Hmm.
So what is that kind of thing? And that's the way I think of understanding, which is a slightly different. I guess the kind of contemporary view of understanding in philosophy, which I don't think is wrong, but kind of doesn't capture this aspect, is that it's something like wisdom. And what these
Okay.
people say is they say you can know that 2 + 2 = 4,
Mm,
um, as in you can just memorize this stuff as a child, and if someone asks you the question, you know the answer. But to understand, you need to know why 2 + 2 = 4.
Hmm.
So they tie that in a sense more to the explanation stuff, and they think kind of, I mean, this is a basic example, but wisdom consists in knowing why things are the way they are rather than just knowing that they are the way they are. But
mm.
I think that's not entirely wrong, but it misses that kind of, in the getting it case, you might, even the explanation needn't be there. I might not know why I get it or not get it. I might not even have the explanation. It's something else. It's like chemistry between people or something.
You know what it is? I wonder if it's a combination, or maybe of several things, but the two things that come to mind are experience and care, like care consideration. So here's an example. By the way, Constantine, you might appreciate this one. So you know the band Queensryche?
Of course.
Yeah, yeah. So there's
How dare
so
you even ask?
I got it. Okay. So I'm like a pretty big fan, especially well the earlier stuff. I don't like the
Of
post
course.
Jeff Tate band. So like
Yeah.
there's so obviously they split up. There's two different versions or were of Queensryche. So there's this really great part. So one of my favorite songs is actually Silent Lucidity, as I'm sure is one of yours. So there's this yeah. So there's this great part of a concert that Jeff is performing. Well, they were all performing it, but so he's going on. And this is great story. And by the way, the punchline is really good too because I think he kind of told the story from like to make the punchline, but it was so like poignant, right? So this is the story, right? So he's talking to his fans, and he's like, he's like the interesting thing about music. He's like, it depends on kind of where you are in your life, and so just to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that I'm going to give you the ingredients. What I'm saying is this is sort of the aura of it or the mystique, because again, maybe the ingredients are what I'm saying, maybe it's something else, maybe not, right? So point is to say that this is the story. So the story is this. So he said, he's like, there's this points in your life where like you kind of get music and it clicks with you, and then like it sort of hits you, and you can't really make sense of it. So he's like, the song Silence, the song Silent Lucidity.
Hmm.
So he said, a fan comes up to me, right, and so a fan says, Jeff, oh my God, he's like, you have this song, and I just can't tell you how much it means to me. He's like, and the guy, and Jeff is like, yeah, like, oh my God, like, wow, thank you so much. He's like, no, you don't understand. He's like, this song, he's like, I heard it the first time like when I was a kid, and I was like, what the hell is this? This is like so fucking stupid. And then at some point in my life, he's like, my father passed away, and then I was sitting there and I'm listening to it and I'm crying and it hits me, and I'm like, oh my, and Jeff is like, oh my God. He's like, brother, but hold on. He's like, that song, what was the name of that song again? And he says, Silence in Tennessee.
Um,
Yeah.
So I'm sure he told a story for the punchline, but like,
um,
but the point is to say, like, there's truth in that, right? So, and I'm sure this was, a real story, but I think for the person, right, he finally gets the song, right? There's some pivotal point in his life where finally, again, my understanding is it is, first of all, he cared to probably really listen and understand the words. And then the other part of it was the experience, because for whatever reason, at that moment in his life, when he heard those words, he's like, oh, I can relate it back to his experience, to my experience.
that's really fun. You guys should do a show on misheard lyrics or something.
Oh, yeah.
There's some good ones out there. But that's I mean, that's a great example. But this is the other thing. How do you know that you've got it rather
Yeah.
than you think you have? And of course, in these cases, someone can. I'm sure Jeff's too polite to sort of. I don't know what he did, but someone could say, "Sorry, but misunderstood that. You've misheard this, that, or the other."
Mhm.
But because there you've got like a factual thing that can. But other times it's not clear that. Um, it's so easy to figure out that you had it right or wrong.
Mm.
And that's particularly true, I think, in relations between humans, whether it's friendship or romantic or something else. And I kind of, there are these examples where when a relationship has broken down, whether it's between family members, friends, romantic partners, and sometimes these things happen because someone changes, but other times someone suddenly has this kind of epiphany where they're like, they were this person all along and I hadn't realized it.
Mm.
All right, it's really quite quite kind of tragic. But when that happens, it's like, for however many years I thought they were this, but how could they be this if they've done this, or they've now revealed it was all a lie or whatever. So these
Hmm.
are kind of really hard lessons where suddenly you feel like, um I thought I'd understood this person, or they'd understood me, and actually, and then you kind of think, how can that, it's one thing, a song lyric but how can this carry on for months, years,
Mm.
decades? Um, and then that makes you kind of think, well, how can we ever be certain that we've understood something or whatever? Wittgenstein has things to say about that, but he's not a skeptic about that. But there is this kind of, in principle, this possibility, I suppose.
Mm.
Hmm. Then I guess that brings me to this question. So you mentioned in the book that Wittgenstein personally found it very difficult to understand and to be understood by others. How do you reconcile this with the philosophical view that knowing other minds is not problematic?
Yeah, thanks. So the being understood by others, I think people used to read that, not wrongly, as, is this Wittgenstein being a bit precious? I'm such a genius, nobody understands me.
Mm.
Sort of, so there's a bit of that at the end of the Tractatus, and or not at the end, in the preface, at the end of the preface. And, I'd be happy if just one person could understand this book, and I don't know what. So there is a little bit of that, and there's some truth in that. But it's clear that he's got this issue when he's writing to friends. So we have these letters between him and some of his friends, in terms of both understanding them and being understood. And there he's actually not talking about the philosophy. So it's not, you don't understand my work. In fact, at some point he even says, that's not what he's interested in, as in, two mathematics scholars might be able to understand themselves perfectly well when they're talking about something formal, but not understand themselves as kind of humans. So that's what he's actually interested in, and that has nothing to do with him thinking he's a precious genius or whatever.
Mm.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but this division, sorry, I didn't answer your question. This division, um, so before I kind of explain it, just to kind of say a bit more about what it is before I try and kind of
Sure.
account for these things. So for those listeners who don't know, um, in his kind of philosophical work, as certainly there's some debates about early on, but what we call the later Wittgenstein, so from philosophical investigations onwards, and his last book on certainty, he's what you'd call an anti-skeptic. So he's someone who thinks we can have knowledge, um, and we can know all sorts of things, that skeptics sometimes sort of say, how can you know this, that, or the other? But he also thinks, I mean, there's a distinction between knowledge and certainty, and there are contexts in which the right word is I'm certain, not I know, and so on. We don't need to worry too
Mm.
much about that right
Sure.
now. But the idea is that he's an anti-skeptic. He doesn't and he's a particular kind of anti-skeptic, in that he doesn't think he's solved. He doesn't think he's got, like, here's why the skeptic is wrong, why the skeptic's views are false. He thinks that skepticism ultimately collapses into nonsense. So he thinks it's
Mm.
it's untenable. It's nonsense. So he thinks and if it's nonsense, you can't even have the thought. That's a kind of weird thing to say, I suppose. But so he thinks that saying, for all I know, you guys might not exist,
Mm.
uh, that and is just nonsense. And
Mm.
whether he's right or wrong about this, we can put that aside. I think he's right, but that doesn't really matter. Um, and he particularly thinks it's kind of nonsense for me to try and convince you guys that, for all I know, you guys don't exist. So there's something kind of
Mm.
bizarre and kind of, at best, um sort of there's a kind of contradiction there. Something's not quite right if that's how if we're not doing it in earnest, really.
Right.
We're just doing philosophy, as he says.
Mm.
Um, and what's weird is for someone who seems to think so, the problem of other minds is really the name of a number of related problems in philosophy. At its extreme, you get solipsism. How do I know you're not all figments of my
Right.
imagination,
Yeah.
and so on? And young Wittgenstein had solipsistic tendencies, and if you kind of become a little less extreme, I might be like, well, you're not figments of my imagination, but how can I know that you're actually conscious and are not zombies or
Mhm.
whatever? And that's kind of a little less extreme, I suppose, but still a pretty extreme, if you're walking around thinking this, pretty extreme view to have. And then you might get a little bit less extreme and think, well, okay, I know you're not zombies, but how can I know that what you see as blue is what I see as blue? And how can I know if you're really in pain? And so there's kind of degrees of skepticism, right? From solipsism on one side to kind of, and as the skepticism become weaker, you may think it starts to become more plausible.
Mm.
Now, Wittgenstein thinks that when we're doing philosophy, there's no kind of theoretical, philosophical ground for skepticism. But what's odd is if you look at his private writings, he seems to think, I mean, he does think that it's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to ever understand another being,
Mhm.
human or non-human. And you kind of read this and you think, oh, that's weird, given his other view. But the problems there are not philosophical theory. They're not, well, in principle, how do I know what's in your mind? The problems are really for him, they're psychological, they're cultural, they're social. And so he kind of he at some point says to a friend, impossible, and then he quickly goes, or near impossible, really hard. And
Mm.
then what he starts to say is that you need to share a lot of things with people in order to get them. This is
Hmm.
the getting kind of stuff I'm interested in. So you have to have shared practices, shared traditions. That's where the form of life stuff comes in. You've got a sort of shared behavior with them. And he thinks if people have radically different upbringings, education, and so on, that will lead to different interests, which lead to different concepts. So a lot of concepts might not travel from one culture to another,
Hmm.
but even from one, within the same country or town, from one household to another, different ways of being, ways of thinking about life, and that's where he thinks the obstacles to understanding come in. That said, it's not like he thinks, oh, he understands his siblings perfectly well, and so there are all these. So that's kind of like a crude picture, but then it can also be that um, I understand you guys better than I understand my sister, and then you got to
Mm.
kind of think, well, why is that? And that will be due to maybe my sister doesn't listen to Queensryche. It could be a
Mm.
whole other. So the stuff we share needn't be especially in this kind of globalized world, the stuff we share needn't be, we're not cave people. It's not the thing next door to us. We might have favorite, TV shows or foods or whatever. So there's all these kind of groups that transcend kind of geographical proximity, you know, whatever, Roman Catholics, vegans, rock and roll fans. So
Hmm.
the way the things you share and don't share with people aren't necessarily tied to your culture in this kind of really old-fashioned 19th century sense, if that makes sense.
Ooh,
Hmm.
as you were talking, this is what came to mind. So, clinically speaking, here's something interesting that happens. So, because I'm going to say there's a subset of patients who are specifically afraid of this, but to be fair, I mean, we all have a fear of this, right? So, but for some people, it's sort of more prominent. I don't know if it's deeper in the sense that it's more intense, but it's certainly more prevalent, right? So, you'll have a subset of patients who do one of two things, right? So, and they fluctuate. So, here's what I mean. So, what happens is there's a kind of an anger, especially when you're misunderstood in therapy, right? So the kind of hope is that if anybody's going to really understand you, it's your therapist. So there's almost sort of an offense there. There's the sense that you don't care enough to understand me, right? So there's this kind of back and forth, and then sometimes the question is asked, like, how come you're taking it so personally? Why is and not in that way? Just to be clear, I'm just kind of saying that on the podcast. But like, there really is this thought of like, why does this feel so personal to you? Because genuinely, most of us can't really understand, the other, right? I mean, it's something that we all struggle with. We kind of, chisel away at our understandings, our interpretations. We refine them repetitively, et cetera, right? But what's interesting is that this specific subgroup of patients, what happens is they actually fluctuate. So they go from I'm upset and I hate you for not understanding me to I believe that you understand everything about me, which is obviously not true either, right? So on the one hand, it's oh my God, you don't get me. You always, right? You always misunderstand me.
Hmm.
And then on the other hand, it's oh my God, I've never been so seen and I've never felt so seen and I've never been so understood before. So it's so interesting as you're talking about this, right? Because, philosophically speaking, like we have, I guess, an idea of what it means to understand a person. But what's so interesting is that, like, truly, though, and listen, to be fair, I mean, this is just a subgroup of people. I'm not saying everybody thinks this way. But what's so interesting is that when you're looking at the real world and you're seeing kind of how this works and how understanding works, what happens is you have, again, at least some people who are so terrified of it that they do one of two things, right? That they're either sort of pissed off and they hate you for not trying hard enough to understand them, which I mean, there could be definitely some truth to that, to be fair. I mean, nobody's, close to being perfect. But with that being said, or they convince themselves that this person, this one human being who, maybe I want to attach to, they fully understand me, right? So it's just the reason why I'm bringing this up is because to me, it's so fascinating, kind of how we cope with what we think of as understanding, right? It's almost as though, for at least some of us, again, maybe all of us, and maybe all of us in some ways, because maybe other people just don't think about it, right? But it's like this fear of not being understood a lot of times is either met with anger and why aren't you trying hard enough, as though, again, it's not like a human flaw, or a complete misunderstanding where you're like, oh my God, this person gets every part of me.
That's really interesting. I didn't know this about the clinical setting, though
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right that it probably speaks more widely as well. Gosh, there's a lot there. I guess I kind of have two immediate reactions to this. One is Wittgenstein himself is not unlike these patients you describe, and part of it is that um, I think the correct way to think about understanding is that it's a matter of degree, not kind. It's not like either you understand me or you don't. It's that there are different degrees to which we might or fail to understand one another. And much as I love Wittgenstein, he doesn't seem to think of it that way. He's more black and white, in which case it's easier to. And I think one reason why he's black and white is, unlike me, this is a vice in me, but he's a perfectionist. As you know by now, it's my fifth time on here. I'm not a perfectionist. So, but he's a perfectionist. So for him, it's a little all or nothing, right? Like they really get me or they haven't understood me at all. And it sounds like the clinical stuff you're describing sounds a bit like that. Now,
Correct.
obviously, that's not the only explanation of what's going on, and there's the need to be understood, and then maybe the shame when you do feel understood, and so there's all these other stuff in the clinical setting, some of which may apply to Wittgenstein as well, but I don't know about that. I'm not a biographer of Wittgenstein, but that was my first thought, was that yeah, if you think of it as a difference in kind rather than degree, then that becomes kind of, it's easier to see how one might flip from one to the other and back. But then there are all these other reasons why you might do so and in fact, actually, Wittgenstein uses these two words which fit your what you were just saying, because he says someone can be a complete enigma.
Mm.
That's you don't understand me at all, blah blah blah. or transparent. We read them like an open book. So that's the two extremes, right? Like these enigmas, complete enigma, and transparent to us. And that sounds a lot like what you were describing. The second thought that in a way bigger that came out of this is that I think you've opened up, and I don't write much about that in the Wittgenstein book, but I'm kind of working on it now a bit. The ethics of understanding is a whole other thing. And so there's the question of do we have a duty to understand? Is it wrong to want to understand? Do we have a duty, do we feel people trying to understand us? Is that something that we should welcome, or does it feel like to some degree an infringement of privacy or something else? So there are these questions. There's a whole separate debate when it comes to evil or so-called evil. What does it take to understand that? Do we have a duty to understand that? Is it immoral to try and understand it? So there are these. So this is. I'm kind of working more on that stuff now. But these are things I don't talk about in the book. But in your clinical setting, these are live questions, and I think it's not just the black and white stuff from before, but there's the ethics of it, especially. Does this medical profession have a duty to understand me? What am I paying you for if you don't
Right.
understand me? And then the ethics of feeling understood, which may also come with resentment, shame, all sorts of other things, right? So there's this huge ethical aspect to it, aside from the kind of philosophy and psychology stuff. And I don't know um, if you want to say something of like in those situations, what does it feel like?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it. Yeah, no. So you have to. So well, I'll tell because I'm gonna try to get away from my feelings. So I'll tell you first.
Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, 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 no. This is good
Um,
because the reason why because I'm gonna intellectualize it, and I literally had to stop myself like in my tracks here. Okay, before I intellectualize it and tell you what's going on and what I do. Yeah. So the feeling is not only of intense uncertainty, it's also of intense dread. Either way, right? So if you're so the fear on the one end is, oh my God, what if this person never feels understood? What if no matter how hard I try, nothing is going to work? What if it really is my fault? I mean, to some extent it is, obviously. But the point is to say, like, what if I'm solely to blame, right? What if I'm not doing my job as a therapist? And then on the other end, when the person feels completely understood, right? It's when is the other shoe going to drop, right? When is going first of all, because that's not true. I don't completely understand anybody. So when is going to come the point when the person realizes, like, oh, hey, wait, hold on. My therapist actually doesn't get me at all, right? Which a lot of times does happen. So yeah, so there's intense fear, but yes, in terms of the actual work, this is where the interpretations come in, and you have to kind of like guide the person to understanding that. So nobody really gets them fully. Nobody also at the one on the other end doesn't completely not get them at all unless they don't know them. So for the most part, like these extreme views, the black and white thinking that it's not either or. That usually it's something in the middle, and the process usually goes where there's again this refinement process where there's through conversation, Hegelian dialectics, right? Sort of right. There's this idea that we kind of chisel away at the sort of at the the dirt or whatever. And we kind of create something a deeper and a more again refined understanding, for lack of a better term. And so what happens is the person learns that sort of as the process goes, that they can and should they have to deal with the uncertainty of whether or not my therapist understands me, just like you have to deal with the uncertainty of whether my partner understands me or whether my mother or my father or whomever else. So yeah, that would be it.
Gosh, that's a tough daily life.
Yeah. Well, so let me just so because I want to kind of go back to the
Y-
book.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Constantine, what's interesting, this is a little bit for us anti-clinical, right? So you go away from understanding people's hidden thoughts, right? Mind reading, which is interesting to me because clinically speaking, we kind of also in some ways go away from mind reading, even though we do try to understand hidden thoughts, right? So it's a little bit different. We hope our patients don't mind read, but we'll kind of try to. So it's a little bit of hypocritical. But the point is to say that you shift away from Wittgenstein, right? So he shifts away from understanding internal states, and then he looks at it broadly in terms of understanding the culture. So can you speak on that?
Yeah, so there's this view which you find in the so-called British empiricists. So this is Berkeley, Locke, and Hume. And Locke, John Locke is like the classic kind of example of this, where he's kind of I think it's a very enchanting view. So while I don't believe it, I often it's very easy to lapse into thinking in this way. So there's good reason for thinking the world might be this way, where he sort of thinks there's stuff hidden in my head and stuff hidden in your heads and heads of anyone listening and so on. And um, communication is about getting stuff from your head into my head and vice versa. So it's kind of you're transporting something. Um, and we need to, language is the vehicle through which, if we both learn the same language, then the stuff in your head gets translated into this common language and then translated. So there's this kind of view of things where everything is hidden in whether you think it's mental states or brain states or whatever. And we're trying to kind of uncode these things. And communication is a way of translating brain things, neural stuff into a common language, and then kind of transporting this stuff. And so mind reading understood this way is I'm trying to read what is in your mind, and I'm going to use, maybe language to ask you questions. But that's where the people who, whether you think the answer is empathy or some kind of theory of information, that's where they think that's how I get access to this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and that requires a kind of mind-body dualism, a sort of idea that there's this stuff that's hidden, and then there's the body that's kind of the frame this stuff is hidden inside, or something like that. Whereas for Wittgenstein, we're trying to understand people, not things hidden inside them. And we understand this kind of inactively, and by talking is not a way of trying to get inside something. Um, it's it's a way of doing things together, if that makes sense. And understanding sort of comes out of that. And it's not two separate things where one is trying to get something out of the other. And it's in the sharing of activities, thoughts, and so on, that understanding emerges. Keeping in mind that he actually thinks it's incredibly hard to ever understand anyone at all, right? So when he
Hmm.
writes the stuff in the philosophy, you think, oh, so he thinks it's that easy. The answer is no. It's really hard.
Mm.
So just because this is the way you do it, it doesn't mean, oh, that's all you need to do and then you've got understanding, right? It's really, really hard. But kind of philosophically, it's just a very different picture of how you do these things. And that's because he thinks that, I mean, there's a very complicated argument for this stuff where he thinks that it's nonsense to think that we can have thoughts and intentions that exist independently of our behavior.
Mm.
And the
Hmm.
very concepts that the concept of fear, the concept of pain, all these concepts are ultimately, he's not a behaviorist in the kind of Skinner sense.
Hmm.
um but there are kind of moments where he's a sort of weak kind of behaviorist, in the sense that he thinks these concepts can't be entirely separated from our behavior. They're kind of logically connected in some way, and therefore you don't need to look for something hidden behind the behavior. It's expressed in the behavior. That's a kind of shortening of the argument.
Mm.
Hmm. And something I wanted to ask, actually, what you just said is kind of related to this, but I'll still ask anyway. So I remember I think it was chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, of the book, you discuss the Wittgenstein's famous remark, "If a lion could speak, we could not understand him." What's your interpretation of that remark, and why do you think it's often misunderstood?
Thanks. I want to talk about this remark. I also do want to hear what you guys think of. I take it behaviorism isn't particularly popular in your line of work these days. So
Oh,
I'll so do you want to do that first, or I do the line
what?
first? I don't mind, but
Actually,
I'm
wait.
interested.
Actually, I'm gonna punt this question to Alan, but here's how I'm gonna frame it to you. Because here's why I say this. Okay, so when you really like the concept of understanding, which we've talked about, God knows how many times on the show. So here's what I would say, right? So in terms of a behavioral perspective, it's very rudimentary and not completely useful because we often misunderstand the intentions behind certain behaviors. So this is why I'm now going to punt the question to you, right? So when you say, seek first to understand, as you tend to say, right? So why is for you the behavior itself not enough? Why is it important for you to understand what goes deeper?
Well, yeah. Well, trying to gauge the perspective the person is coming from by um, one, listening to what it is that they're saying to you, and then trying to uh, let them know back what it is that they said in a summary, as if you had understood it, or if you actually understood it. They then feel understood during that process, and then you may be then able to introduce a new concept yourself or ask them to share more in order to at least repeat back to them what you think you understood about what they're saying. And then that may create a rapport, a shared understanding. Um, yeah.
Right, so would you say that the action is just not enough, just seeing what they do?
You can gauge something. You can gauge something from their action. I suppose in the context of, if it's somebody from maybe a similar culture as you, or maybe within a certain physical setting, maybe, and I'm being very broad here, but yeah, you could probably maybe gauge something from their behavior, but to get a certain degree of understanding. I mean, it on that spectrum, it definitely wouldn't be a high level of
Yeah.
understanding. Yeah.
That's what I figured your perspective was. Yeah, I actually agree 100% with that. So that's my
So,
interpretation.
so okay, okay. So, um, so Wittgenstein doesn't disagree with you guys on
Mhm,
this. So,
mhm.
so I don't know if Alan, if you had a slightly different take from Leon, or if it's identical. But it's not as if, because he thinks it's so hard, it's not as if, oh yeah, the behavior tells you everything you want to know, and then you're done.
Sure.
It's not that. It's that sometimes the behavior is, after all, puzzling, and this is part of what's going on with the lion, but also with he likes to talk of tribes a lot, which is
Mm.
maybe a bit odd today, but the behavior of strangers, hence my subtitle, "Strangers in a Strange Land." So you go to some strange land and people behave in strange ways. So it's not as if, oh, you see behavior and you've understood, right? It's not
Right.
that. It's that the behavior has to kind of be contextualized. So you need to know, what are they doing when they do these things? Someone enters a Christian church and sees someone go, "Body of Christ," and then gives
Mhm.
it to someone who eats it, and you think, they eat their own God.
Mhm.
What are they doing?
Sure.
And so it's not that observing behavior magically gives you understanding. It's that to understand behavior, you then need to look at to understand a particular piece of behavior. You've got to look at the sort of practices it's nested within, whether these are social ones or maybe individual ones, someone keeping a private notebook, or it needn't be like the behavior of a big group. And practices may be very complicated and related to all sorts of things. So in trying to figure out why someone, and behavior includes verbal behavior here, why someone would say what they say, or do what they do, you need to do a lot more searching, and you may never get to the bottom of it,
Mm.
because we're complex people, and there's a lot of stuff, and
Hmm.
people can, of course, hide things from you or mislead you, and so on. But all of this is, you're still looking at stuff that's externally available. You're not trying to
Mhm.
get inside a head. You're trying to just get wider and wider circles of this person's world. That's the
Hmm.
difference between the Lockean view and the Wittgensteinian view. But it's certainly not. Yeah, there's thought. You're trying to get to why someone would behave this way, and it's not behavioral. well, it's not this person's behavior all the way down. You need to look at all
Right.
sorts of other things. I don't know. Maybe that's still not persuasive, but I was trying to sort of
Well, can
say at
I?
least it's yeah. Go on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. So here's what I would add. I mean, so like I think an example going back to the lion passage. So I think that's a good example, like in terms of animals. I mean, we can hypothesize, and technically speaking, I mean, obviously anthropologists do, zoologists do. I mean, they definitely have their understandings. And listen, I'm not one, so I'm assuming they're virtually right, especially when it comes to chimps, which seems maybe a little bit more obvious. But I mean, at the end of the day, there's still we impose our well, not we, because I'm not an expert in this, but the experts impose their interpretations onto the animal kingdom. I don't know. My thinking, I guess, is just easier with humans because humans can directly tell you, even though, yes, they have the ability and do often conceal. I think on the other end, well, not I think, I know, on the other end, they do also sometimes tell you the truth. So I don't know. I guess my thinking here is that when it comes to understanding behavior, I mean, it's just so open to misunderstanding that I don't know. I guess it seems like he's putting it on somewhat of a pedestal here. And I get why, obviously, it's important. But I do think that you can know the hidden things of people's minds. I mean, to some extent, even though, yes, a lot of times they lie and you'll never have, high degree of certainty, but it's definitely higher than I guess I would say with animals on the whole, maybe not with chimps, but maybe with other animals. I mean, again, for the most part, we kind of just, it's not necessarily complete guesswork. And this is my ignorance shown because I'm certainly not a zoologist. But the point is to say, I mean, a lot of it is just, like the stuff with dogs and cats. Do they love us? Do they not love us? And, there are articles on this, like, does my cat love me? I'm like, how the fuck does anybody know?
I have a question for you,
What?
actually. Do you, it may be a silly question, but do you think that you could understand someone who could not speak, for example, who is a mute?
Oh, that's a great question. So, by the way, speaking of this, I'm going to give you a
Yeah.
sort of a cop-out answer, but I will answer the question. So there's actually a field in autism, like an autism treatment, which is but autism research. So it's pretty much a field that sort of it postulates that autistic people, the nonverbal ones, actually do communicate with you, right? So a lot of times, especially when this goes into like the batshit areas, it's pretty much like there's like the spirit there, and the spirit is trying to communicate with you, et cetera, et cetera. So I really want to be careful in just like the words that I choose to use here. But the point is to say, it's bullshit, right? So there was a long time ago a treatment for autistic people, which is for at this point completely been debunked, where it's like, so you would take the person's hand, right, and you pretty much like you'd write things out, right, and they would be like, oh my god, it's the autistic person communicating with you. So to answer your question, I think the answer is no.
Okay, but what if the person's not autistic?
Oh,
Like
so
just somebody is just mute due to some sort, I don't know,
and your
an
question is,
accident
can
or
you
something.
understand them?
Well, do you think that you could? Because, for example, you mentioned before, you could ask somebody what it is they think, and maybe they'll tell you the truth, maybe they
Right, right,
won't, and
right.
you can gauge something from that.
Oh yeah.
But if they
Oh,
can't,
so yeah.
yeah,
Oh, okay, great. So
yeah.
I would say it's degrees, right? So I think that the highest level of understanding is when there's a harmony between behavior and speech, right? So let's say that's the highest to me. And then if you want to go lower, right, like maybe there's not necessarily speech, but there's behavior. And then if you want to go lower than that, it might be something like it's still a behavior, but it's just like a gesture, right? So I would say there are degrees, and that those degrees pretty much correlate with your sense of certainty. So even though yes, there's not a high degree of certainty with somebody who isn't verbal, I would say there's still some degree of certainty as long as there are gestures, right? And I would say with autism, which is obviously, especially the degree here that I'm talking about, the extreme version of it, no, I don't think that there's any way that you could understand somebody who's severely autistic. I
Mhm.
think that's a complete myth. But other than that, the answer to your question is yes, but
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe I've misunderstood. I mean, it seems to me, to the extent that you can understand it, the answer might be no in the sense that we can never understand anyone. But if we're assuming, there are degrees of understand, I don't see, unless I've misunderstood, I don't see the mute thing as a problem at all, unless they also can't write, and they also can't communicate. I mean, there's people who communicate with blinking.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's got to be this is the shared behavior thing.
Right.
Now, if
Yeah.
it's they can't blink, and they're in a coma and they can't speak, they can't write, they can't blink, then of course it starts to get really hard. Or you might think, what is there to understand, or so on. So I'm not sure but I don't think not being able to speak is any obstacle at all per se.
I think the same way. Yeah, that's why I just posed the question, only because of the way you framed your answer earlier. Is
It was a
it?
trap for Leon,
I
and he
know, right?
fell
Yeah.
right. He fell right into.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
He
I'm not
fell
black.
right.
I'm not black and white about it. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
But
um,
you know what it is? The way I interpreted your question, I think what you were getting at is the way I understood it was that Alan was asking about extreme cases. That's why came up with the autistic, the severe autism example in my mind. Because what happens is a lot of time when you have people who are just either even sometimes in vegetative states, right? There's this sector of pseudoscientific, spiritualist, new age, whatever, and like this movement of people who are saying things like, even though this person is in the vegetative state, right? They are completely mute, obviously, right? But they can communicate and they can understand everything you're saying. That's what I thought you were hinting at. I thought you were saying, like, hey, do you think that these people can communicate in ways that are, I don't know, kind of supernatural, maybe in the way? And the answer is definitely
No,
not.
fair enough. No, I just was trying to just get to a point where I was like, in my question, it was just trying to point out that maybe if you thought about someone who you couldn't like
Yeah.
speak with, could you still get a high level of understanding about them? And
Gotcha.
I think you
Oh,
could.
because like
Yeah.
I did put speech on kind of a pedestal. Yeah,
it's
yeah,
well,
yeah.
I think it's because then I said verbal behavior, and that can
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
misunderstood. Right, the line. I'm actually writing a book on the line at the moment because I've
Mm.
decided
Oh,
it needs
okay.
a separate, sort of less academic, because this book was quite sort of intricate in places. So my ethologist friends hate this stuff in Wittgenstein because
Mm.
they're like, "What do you mean if we understand lions?" Blah
Mm.
blah blah.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to write this book where there's like a chapter per word in this sentence. So you have if, and you look at all the kind of, what do you mean if a lion could speak, animals speak already, and so on.
Mm.
And then another thing one of the ones I've done already is the we, is the who are we, and a lot of
Mhm.
people when they read this remark in Wittgenstein or hear it, they think lion stands for animals and we stands for humans.
Mm.
So they really read it as a remark about humans can't understand animals or whatever. And to some degree, humans can't understand non-human animals.
Right.
Um, but there's a reason why Wittgenstein says, and he doesn't even say lions, he says a lion. And I think it's because he would have thought that with cats and dogs, they're a bit too domestic for him to say we couldn't understand them.
Mhm.
Now, remember, this is someone who thinks we can't understand other humans anyway, but he's you know, or it's very hard to, and it's not that he thinks we have some kind of easy understanding of, but they share something with us. They share some primitive concepts with us. If my dog has some concept of what it is to wait, it's not the same as my concept, but there is some concept of weight, of food, of whatever. So on the
Mm.
Mhm.
one hand, I think he doesn't want to go with non-human animals that we share some kind of forms of life with.
Mhm.
Um, but nor does he want to go so far that we might start to wonder whether there's anything to understand at all, like
Mm.
worms or
Mhm.
something. If a
Mm.
worm could speak, so with the lion, you kind of think, well, it's not as close to me as like a cat or a dog, but it's not as alien as as a worm. I don't know why I
Mm.
keep saying, I mean, there's other examples, but it's not.
Sure.
It's not. So it's kind of in the middle in
Mm.
in some way. This we recognize things. Behavior, praying, so
Mm.
on. Ethologists will understand all sorts of things about lions. But I think what he has it in for, and he is so that there was a sort of, I mean, think of things like Doctor Dolittle or whatever.
Mm.
What are other examples? You get this in like Grimm fairy
Yeah, yeah.
tales, Narnia, which I think he had read parts of. So this idea that I mean, Narnia is a bit more complicated because it's got like religious element. Alice in Wonderland, the sort of stuff where you think, oh, if the lion could speak, it would say, what time is it, Alan, or something like that. And that all it's missing is the words, and it has these growls, and if only we could translate them into
Right, right,
English, we'd know what
right.
it was saying. And I think what Wittgenstein's trying to get to is that the concepts of a lion are radically different.
Mhm.
The world of the lion is radically different to the world. Now, you could say we is all humans, but I actually think he thinks that, maybe the person who lived with lions out in the wild could understand lions I mean, I would say to some degree, as in,
Sure.
but I think he kind of thinks of we is not the lion tamer or the ethologist, let alone the person living with lions. Tarzan is not part of Wittgenstein's we, put it that way.
Mhm.
Mm.
So I think it's part of what's going on is it's not just we speak German, French, English, whatever, they speak Lionese. It's that um, our worlds are entirely different, and we couldn't understand Tarzan if he spoke, um, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So
Mowgli and Kipling or whatever. Yeah, sorry, go.
no, so what do you think Wittgenstein would have thought of the ultra scientific field of evolutionary psychology then?
I got to tread carefully here.
And by the way, I'm a
Wittgenstein.
fan. I'm a fan of the field, but I'm just asking.
My wife's a big fan of evolution. Wittgenstein is not anti-science
Okay.
and is certainly not anti-evolution. But there are things in evolutionary psychology that he would not like, particularly some of the explanations of behavior that it comes up with. And I think that's partly, and again, I mean, evolutionary psychology, there's a lot of
Yeah.
evolutionary psychologists with a lot of different views, and some are more subtle than others. But sometimes when evolutionary psychologists explain human action, they say why does someone do this, and then they explain it in terms of natural selection or whatever.
Mating
Whereas I
selection.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, whereas I think Wittgenstein wants to say, well, that can't be this person's reason. That may nest an explanation way down the line, but
Hmm.
that can't be the reason for which someone acted. That may, you've got to you
Hmm.
start with that and you say, well, why is that a reason? Why is that? And somewhere down the line, that will explain something, but
Hmm.
that there's a lot that's kind of missed. So I do think some evolutionary psychology is when it comes to action explanation, which is my field. I can't judge it on other stuff because it's not my field. When it comes to action explanation, I think it can be a bit crude, or it kind of might make a category mistake in that it tries to explain specific actions by talking about why kinds of actions even exist or something like that.
Yeah.
So I get a little bit a little bit unsure about some of these claims, but that is certainly not to diss it as a film. I also get upset when people talk of design in evolutionary psychology. And of course, many evolutionary psychologists don't do that, but a lot of them do slip into design talk. And I really kind of, you don't need design to talk about this
Yeah.
stuff. And I think it distorts when you say, or when people say things like, you know, this was meant for that kind of intention talk, design talk. I think that needs to be it. I know people say it's just a metaphor, but it's
Right, right.
best without it. I think it's very misleading.
Well, I mean,
Um, yeah.
do you want to?
Did you want to say
I just
something?
want to continue this.
Oh, go ahead.
So, okay, yeah. So, with evolutionary psychology, I mean, the understanding, or whatever my basic understanding of it is, we try to understand, our species, obviously, but we also try to understand, kind of hidden meanings, right? Which is very, I guess, psychological. And I think the point is, we put these patterns together in order to navigate the world, right? So, this is where I would sort of ask about Wittgenstein, right? And not to ask it in the least offensive way possible, because it might sound a little bit bad. But somebody's going to ask, like, what's the point, right? What is the point of us? So if on the in his private notes, if he kind of struggles with this and wonders, can we really understand something, etc., or sorry, can we understand someone? What is the point, right? So what is the purpose of trying to understand somebody? What is the purpose of writing about understanding people? What is the purpose of making it seem or feel so important? Like, what do we get from this, right? Because the evolutionary psychologists, basically they would say, well, the reason why we need to feel this because there are these, again, hidden motives that many of us are not aware of, and because we're not aware of them, it's hard to navigate relationships, right? So what would be the point here in Wittgenstein's understanding of why we need understanding?
Excellent question, and not in the least
Okay.
rude or whatever you were worried about. Um, One quick thing, and one, if we've got a few minutes,
We
a
got plenty
slightly
of time.
a
Go for
slightly
it.
longer thing. You can edit me out if I go over
Shoot.
after. So one quick thing that I think is interesting in relation to your question is so Wittgenstein's he starts philosophy kind of early 20th century and is dead by 52. Um, and initially becomes a disciple of Freud. And he
Mm,
says, Freud is amazing. And certainly the stuff about hidden motives and so on, he's not in the least skeptical about this aspect of Freud. And he become, and Wittgenstein's from Vienna as well. And he's, huge respect for Freud initially.
mm,
And then there is a kind of move away, but it's not some kind of Freud is all wrong, or it's not like he goes Jungian or anything. It's more that he thinks when he starts to look at how Freud uses reason and cause, and he starts these little niggles on conceptual stuff and Freud, and what part of what he's interested in is Freud is right about motives, but he thinks motives are the same as intention, and so you start to get so he's doing this kind of really quite careful, not careful studies of Freud like in detail, but he looks at Freud's language and he looks at the concepts of reason, intention, motive, cause, action, behavior, and he thinks there's something slightly crude happening in Freud.
mhm,
He's particularly got it in for the notion of unconscious reasons and the
mm,
unconscious as a spatial location or whatever. So there's this stuff in Wittgenstein, but that's partly to say, of course he's aware, and self-understanding, which we haven't spoken about, is not no easier than, and it's even harder because hanging out with myself isn't going to help,
mhm, mhm,
self-understanding, introspection doesn't help according to Wittgenstein, but certainly hanging out with you, you might get more self-understanding by talking to others,
Hmm.
and seeing how they react to you, for example. So you've got all that stuff, and in that sense, um, he's not averse to. I mean, he was really into confession, and that's not a
mm.
million mile removed from kind of clinical
Yep.
sort of settings. Okay, sorry, that was meant to be the short bit. The long bit will be no longer, I think. Um, so I'm in the real life stuff. These are not just. I should have said this earlier. They're not just abstract confessions to friends about why he thinks they can't there's very real reasons why he's writing these letters, and in the one I'll tell you about, there's like two letters each way. It's him and his friend Paul Sraffa, who was a Piero Sraffa, who was a famous economist, Italian economist. The friendship ends with the last letter. He
Mm,
ends the friendship, so it really matters to him because this was his dear friend, and he thinks they've reached the point where they should not be friends anymore. So for him, it's not theory. It's it's really kind of serious. And
mhm,
Straffa was very important to Wittgenstein's philosophical development. He had a lot of respect for him as an economist, but also for philosophical insights and so on. And if you kind of look at these letters, it's really weird.
mm,
I might get specific details not quite right, but as I understand it, Wittgenstein is visiting his friend von Richt or von Wright, depending how people want to pronounce it, in Cambridge, who's taken over Wittgenstein's kind of chair.
Hmm.
Um, and Schraffer's mother has died. And von Richt says, "Oh, did you send condolences to Schraffer?" And they all use their surnames when they talk.
mhm,
And Wittgenstein's like, "No." And von Richt is like, what do you mean? His mother's died. You didn't send flowers, you didn't send that. So he sort of basically tells him, get on the phone now to Sraffa. And so Wittgenstein calls Sraffa and he messes it up. He says something like, I didn't send my condolences because I didn't want to. He says something like really,
Oh Christ, he really was autistic, man.
I mean, there is this reading of extent, and he says, and he's got this stuff about how it's just we know this because it's then brought up in the letters. It's just it. I'd be doing it because it was the thing to do, and not because I wanted to do it, and I don't know
Wow.
what.
Mhm.
And then we know this because then there's this then clearly, I mean, I'm sort of inferring this. There's a letter after, and I think this is the bit that's inference that von Richt, hearing this conversation, was like, "What the f did you just tell him?"
Mhm.
Uh, right, So then he writes this letter. Says, "Oh no, I meant to say, it came across as not because I wanted to, but I meant to. There were two knots. It was not because I didn't want to, but I coughed and the line was bad, and so you may have. So these letters are going on about this, and in the last one, he says it would be better if some people's heads were like elephants and others like fish and whatever other, because then we wouldn't look like each other and therefore wouldn't be tempted into thinking we had any chance of understanding one
Mm.
another."
Wow.
And then he ends the
Interesting.
friendship like this.
Okay.
And there's this stuff about how you and I can never be friends because we don't share any, and you're just sitting there
Oh, there it is.
going,
Oh, you'll never understand me. Oh my God,
yeah,
that's it. That's the
yeah,
clinical shit. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. But it comes out in this particular. So there's a few of these with other people, but in this particular case, yeah, it's very clear. It comes out of this thing of like he didn't send condolences, and then fucked up the
Yeah.
apology, and then Sraffa, wrote back, and so why does it matter? Well, it mattered to him because he was invested in this friendship, but at the same time, for whatever you can, whatever clinical diagnosis you may want to get, for whatever reason, he couldn't see the point of carrying on.
Yeah.
And he's also got this in relation to understanding the past. So we haven't talked much about understanding kind
Mm.
of people from not other cultures, but past periods.
Hmm.
And he basically, I mean, we do a lot of, if I teach philosophy, I might do Wittgenstein, Hume,
Mhm.
Plato, whatever. And Wittgenstein basically thinks, oh, you can't understand dead people's thoughts. So
Mm.
and he thinks, in a way, he thinks that teaching history of philosophy, in a way in which you pretend, in his view, he uses the word profess. In fact, he congratulates a friend and for getting a teaching job, and he says, "Well, you're lucky you're not a professor because you don't need to profess that you understand these people."
Mm.
Wow.
And so there's this kind of stuff as well, where it's real to him because he thinks, I'm surrounded by people pretending to know, forget me, pretending to know what Plato thought or what Hume thought or whatever. And he'd probably hate the thought of any book saying, here's what Wittgenstein thought.
By the way, I have to add this. Okay. So interposing my own clinical interpretation, I'm not giving any diagnoses. But yeah, this is legitimately what you see in therapy. So here's how I would have interpreted, right? So anytime there's a particular criticism, oftentimes the sort of the idea of you didn't understand me is really a blanket for how dare you blame me for this. Yup, yup, yup. So a lot of
So,
times it's so the understanding, right? It's not so much that I'm at fault, it's that you misunderstood my intentions. It's not that I was rude, it's not that I was careless, offensive, thoughtless, whatever. It's just you don't get me, right? So it sounds like what's happening is Wittgenstein was using the cover of misunderstanding as saying, well, you didn't care enough to really get my deeper intentions, even though he really did. And so it's not, maybe he didn't mean to be an asshole, but he was an asshole, right? So we have this a lot, friendships too. We also have this a lot in therapy where the understanding is So I just want to try to carefully word what I'm saying because I don't want to be offensive, but this is true, right? So what happens is when a person gets criticized, they get super defensive. And then the thinking is, again, remember, you really understood me, which tends to mean, honestly, it tends to mean that you don't criticize me, right? You don't hold me accountable. It means you understand everything that I do, so you don't think of me as a bad person, which is just not realistic. I
Mm.
mean, yes, nobody's a bad person, but that doesn't mean we don't think that you guys don't do bad things. Or any of us, me too, right? So, but with that being said, again, it's usually a cover for how dare you criticize me. So what I think was happening here was Wittgenstein kind of threw his hands up and he said, hey, I don't want this anymore. It's not for me. It can't work. Because what he was really looking for was like a sort of a father-like figure who was pretty much going to excuse everything that he did. I don't think it was a lack of understanding. I think if anything, it's not that it was because he didn't ask for forgiveness. I was going to say it was a lack of forgiveness. It's not that. I think it was pretty much a lack, what's the word? Not necessarily exoneration, but I think fundamentally it was pretty much him holding him accountable. And I don't think, and from everything I've read about Wittgenstein, it seems like he wasn't really too keen on that.
No, this sounds right. So there's definitely this sort of um it's a defense mechanism because otherwise I've done this inexcusable thing, but blah
Right.
blah blah. And but it's also I do think it cuts both ways in that, so people say, is to understand everything to forgive everything? And the answer may be no. If you understand someone all too clearly, it's even worse. And
Mm.
and there's a sense in which I think he might be thinking, if I've understood you and you've understood me, we're really opposed on these things, and you must think me a terrible person, and I would think you a terrible person. And it's much better to think, no, no, we clearly just don't understand each other.
Hmm.
Because
Mm.
if I have understood you, you're accusing me of I don't know what. And if I've been understood, and of course there I think the defense mechanism thing is very plausible. Um, so I think there's this stuff where clear understanding um could also lead to the end of the friendship in this kind of worse way. Wittgenstein, in other modes, we talked of confessional before, um, is certainly capable of asking for forgiveness, but that's not what's going on here, like you said. Um, and it's not a one-off. So he's there's other friendships that are
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah. No,
so
no, but
there's a
that that,
pat
that
there's a
that's
pattern.
yeah, yeah. So that's literally it. So when we're thinking about it in that kind of way or in
Mm.
that context, I think again the thinking there is that like he's saying essentially that it's your fault. It's your fault for not understanding me because if you would have understood me, you wouldn't have criticized me in the first place. That's it. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's like that. But it is also, I don't understand you.
Yeah.
Now, whatever that works doing, maybe you think that's superficial and it's just glossing the other stuff, or maybe he thinks, how could I understand someone who doesn't understand me, or whatever. But that stuff's going on. So you're quite right that someone could do a play about this or
I
something.
know.
It's an interesting it's
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
interesting setting. But that's the kind of why in the real world he's looking at that stuff, and the stuff he says, I don't think it's incompatible with the philosophy stuff, because the objections to understanding are not because I could never know what's in someone else's. They're not, he's not doing philosophy,
Yeah.
right? They're kind of, for better or worse, maybe, and he may be self-deceived and all this stuff, but the objections are psychological, cultural, social. Then they're not an evil demon might be deceiving me into thinking this is what you mean. Like, he's not doing philosophy, and
Mm.
he thinks the philosophy stuff is nonsense and unimportant. The
Hmm.
real worrying stuff is this thing. Um,
Yeah, because I mean, going back to like what Alan was talking about with understanding, because for me, I mean, obviously for all of us, I'm sure, but there's kind of a sense that this makes sense, like this has a purpose. So we're trying to understand in order to, let's say, to have a you know what it is, and this is something we haven't touched on, but this is where I'm going. We want to have a harmonious understanding of reality. Fundamentally, it's the reality that matters, right? So if you and I keep going and this dialogue keeps happening, we'll have a shared understanding of what's happening between us. We'll be able to resolve problems, effectively communicate, obviously, in the
Mhm.
future, right? Build rapport, build trust, etc. Right. So what I love about your understanding here is, the interpretation is that why it matters is that practically speaking, without it, it's just chaotic.
Mhm.
So
So
this is the thing. So you've got, sorry, Alan, were you gonna?
No, no, no. I was
No.
just listening intently.
Oh, so the time, I mean, I guess every age thinks the times we live in, but they do seem particularly bad right now. So that, there's this kind of, and Wittgenstein would not be on this team. There's this sort of hope some people have where, oh, if only we understood one another, we would all get on and there'd be no wars. And oh, if only Trump and Zelensky understood each other. And I think on that stuff, Wittgenstein's kind of on the right side. The problem is not misunderstanding. The problem is unwillingness to, or all sorts of other kind of stuff. It's not that understanding would magically take care of everything, but you can see why people think we need interfaith discussions, we need intercultural, whatever we need. And of course, that was very different in 19th and 20th century kind of anthropology than it is now in the world we live in. The way we go about these things are radically different. But there's this, I feel like there's a kind of there's a lot in between, but on one extreme there's the people who think we just need to understand one another and then all the fighting will end.
mm,
And then there's the other people who either think, well, that's not possible, so forget it, or even if it were possible, could get even worse once the problem is not understanding what
right, right.
Trump what's going on in Trump's mind or whatever. Um, so yeah, and it's, I think on the one hand it's tempting to think understanding really matters because if only we can do this, it will all be fine. And then you kind of think, well, that seems a little idealistic.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, that I would say maybe understanding and accountability in whatever, shape or form
Yeah,
that takes.
accountability is pretty important thing. But and I guess that leads us to the much we not we can't do this now, but the vexed question of can you understand, evil actions and what does it take to
Yeah.
understand them and this
That
this
that I
this
would
kind of
argue would
stuff.
take an entirely separate podcast. Yeah, yeah.
And I actually
This is
can't wait
we're
for
not
that
going
book.
there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then absolutely. And you know what we'll do?
Well,
Because you're
yeah.
writing the book on the line, so we'll have you back on whenever that's out, and then we'll pick up on the evil
We'll
question.
get Mark White as well, so it's
Yo, he'd love that. I'm sure he'd love that.
You wrote a book also on ethics, no?
On ethics, yeah, yeah. He wrote a book on Batman and ethics. Yeah, yeah, which deals with
Yeah.
evil. All right. So, Alan, final questions for Constantine before we wrap up.
I actually have a million, but seeing as how we don't have time, I just wanted to ask if we wanted to follow your work, and of course, buy the book
At a discount.
and as well as the discount code. Where can we do that? Yeah.
Oh yes. Okay. So in terms of the book, so the book is currently, well, it's out in a couple of days, but by the time this airs, I think it will be out. It's first out in quite an expensive hardback, but also an affordable ebook, PDF, or Kindle. And
Mm.
on both, you can get 35% off if you go to Anthem Press's website. So if you buy it straight, the publisher is Anthem. If you buy it straight from them, and there's a discount code is SEWPC35. I don't know if we can get that on the
Yeah.
screen or something. So
We'll get it on the screen.
and that gets you 35% off. It will be out in paperback next year. And so there's that option as well. Follow me, following, never follow anyone, but Blue Sky, not the platform formerly known as Twitter. Blue Sky is probably the best place.
See Sandis.
C Sandis, thank you. Yes.
There you go. All
Um,
right.
C-
Constantine, thank you so much for coming on, man. As
This
always,
is awesome.
fucking
Yeah.
excellent episode.
Yeah.
I really enjoy talking to you guys, and I'm now thinking of Wittgenstein in these clinical scenarios and all this
Love
other
it.
stuff.
Yeah,
So,
he would have been such a
excellent.
fascinating patient, man. My God.
Yeah.
All right, Constantine, man, thank
Yeah.
you.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you
All
for
right.
everything, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right, see you.
Bye, guys. See you.
Awesome. All right. So everyone, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit
hit
the
the
bell
bell
on
on
YouTube.
YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.